The chains cut into Elena's wrists as two guards dragged her through the stone corridor, her bare feet scraping against cold rock. Torches flickered on the walls, throwing long shadows that seemed to reach for her like claws. She did not scream. She did not beg. She only walked, her chin lifted, even as the guards yanked her forward with rough hands. "Wolfless trash," one guard muttered, his grip tightening on her arm. "The king wastes his dungeon space on you." Elena said nothing. She had learned, long ago, that silence was safer than words. Words could be twisted. Words could be used as weapons against her. So she kept her mouth shut and let her eyes study everything around her instead, memorizing every turn, every door, every guard's face. The Crimson Moon Kingdom was not a place for the weak. It was a land ruled by shifters, men and women who could become wolves at will, whose strength and speed made ordinary humans look fragile in comparison. And at the very top of this world sat Alpha King Draven, a man whose name alone made grown warriors lower their eyes. Elena had heard stories about him long before she ever set foot in his kingdom. They said his eyes turned the color of blood when he was angry. They said no wolf, no matter how powerful, dared to challenge his authority. They said he had never lost a fight, never shown mercy, and never once knelt before another living soul. She was about to become his prisoner. The guards shoved her through a heavy iron door, and she stumbled into a dark cell that reeked of mildew and old stone. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the corridor like a final verdict. Elena sank onto the cold floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and closed her eyes. She was not wolfless. That was the lie she had told them, the lie that had kept her alive this long. If they knew the truth about what lived inside her, they would not have thrown her in a cell. They would have killed her on the spot. 3 days passed in that cell before anyone bothered to speak to her again. A servant girl brought her a bowl of thin broth once a day, sliding it under the door without meeting her eyes. Elena drank it slowly, savoring the little warmth it gave her, and listened to the sounds of the palace above. Footsteps, distant laughter, the occasional howl of a wolf shifting somewhere in the courtyard. On the 4th day, the guards came for her again. "The king wants to see the new prisoners," one of them announced, his voice bored, as if this were a routine he had performed 100 times before. "Line up. Don't speak unless spoken to." Elena was pulled from her cell, along with a dozen other captives, all of them shackled together in a long line. She recognized some of the faces from the transport wagons that had brought them to this kingdom weeks earlier. Criminals, debtors, a few unlucky travelers who had crossed into the wrong territory at the wrong time. None of them looked like her, though. None of them carried the secret she carried. They were marched into a grand hall with towering ceilings and pillars carved from black stone. Banners, bearing the crest of the Crimson Moon Kingdom, hung from the walls, a snarling wolf silhouetted against a blood-red moon. At the far end of the hall sat a throne, and on that throne sat the Alpha King himself. Draven was younger than Elena had expected, though his presence filled the room in a way that made his age irrelevant. His dark hair was cut short, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, when they finally settled on the line of prisoners before him, held no warmth at all. He wore simple black clothing, no crown, no jewels, yet somehow he looked more powerful than any king Elena had ever imagined. One by one, the guards called out the prisoners' crimes and their wolf status. Most of the captives were shifters of low rank, their wolves weak or untrained, deemed unworthy of much attention. Draven barely glanced at them before waving a hand, sending them off to labor in the mines or the fields. Then it was Elena's turn. "This one," the guard announced, shoving her forward, "claims to be wolfless, found wandering near the eastern border, with no pack, no papers, no explanation." A murmur rippled through the hall. Wolfless humans were rare in the Crimson Moon Kingdom, and those who were captured were usually treated as curiosities rather than threats. Too weak to fight, too fragile to be useful for anything but menial labor. Draven's gaze finally landed on her, and Elena felt the full weight of it settle over her like a physical force. She refused to look away. She refused to bow her head the way the other prisoners had. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Curiosity, perhaps, or mild irritation at her defiance. But it passed quickly, replaced by clear disinterest. "A wolfless prisoner is no threat and no asset," Draven said, his voice low and even. carrying easily across the silent hall. Put her with the others. I have no time to waste on someone who cannot even shift. The guards grabbed her arms again, pulling her away from the throne. Elena did not resist, but as she was dragged past the king, she allowed herself one final look at him. He had already turned his attention to the next matter of business, dismissing her entirely from his mind. Good, she thought. Let him underestimate me. It was safer that way. She was thrown back into the dungeon, this time into a lower cell, deeper beneath the palace, where the air was damp and the darkness nearly complete. The guards seemed to have already forgotten about her, treating her assignment as a formality, rather than anything requiring real attention. That suited Elena just fine. Weeks passed in the darkness. Elena learned the rhythm of the dungeon, when the guards changed shifts, when meals were delivered, when the palace above grew quiet at night. She kept to herself, speaking only when necessary, always watching, always listening. The other prisoners in the nearby cells whispered about her sometimes, calling her the Wolfless girl, wondering aloud why she had been captured at all if she posed no danger. Elena let them wonder. Let them believe whatever story made sense to them. But at night, alone in the darkness, she allowed herself to remember. She remembered her mother's face, soft and tired, whispering warnings into her ear. She remembered the fire that had taken everything from her, the flames that had consumed the only home she had ever known. She remembered running, always running, learning to hide the one thing that made her different from every other human in this world. She was not Wolfless. She was something far more dangerous. Something the Crimson Moon Kingdom believed had vanished from the world 300 years ago. A bloodline so rare, so feared, that entire packs had once hunted its last remaining members to extinction. She was a voice. It was a gift, passed down through generations of women in her family. A power that allowed her to command the wolf inside any shifter, no matter their rank or strength. A single word from a true voice could make the fiercest alpha kneel, could stop a battle before it began, could turn the tide of an entire war. It was a power so dangerous that kingdoms across the land had once agreed on a single law. Any voice discovered within their borders was to be executed immediately. No trial, no mercy. Elena's mother had tried to hide her from that fate. She had taught Elena to suppress the power from the moment she was old enough to understand what it meant, drilling into her the importance of silence, of never letting the command slip from her lips no matter the danger she faced. It had worked for years. Elena had learned to swallow her fear, to endure hardship without ever calling upon the power that lived inside her. But her mother was gone now, taken by hunters who had somehow learned the truth. Elena had barely escaped with her life, fleeing across 3 kingdoms, before finally being captured at the border of the Crimson Moon territory. She had told them she was wolfless, because it was the only lie that made sense, the only story that would let her survive long enough to figure out her next move. She had not expected to end up in the dungeon of the most feared Alpha King in the land. On the 20th night of her imprisonment, everything changed. Elena was asleep on the thin pile of straw that served as her bed, when the sound of the cell door creaking open jolted her awake. A guard stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking most of the torchlight from the corridor. Elena recognized him immediately, a young man named Corwin, one of the lower-ranked guards who patrolled the dungeon at night. He had watched her with unsettling interest for the past week, always finding excuses to linger near her cell. "Get up," Corwin said, his voice thick with something Elena did not like. She rose slowly, keeping her back against the stone wall, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want?" Corwin stepped into the cell, closing the door behind him. "The other guards think you're just some wolfless nobody, but I've been watching you. There's something strange about the way you move, the way you look at people. I think you're hiding something." "You're mistaken," Elena said, forcing her voice to stay steady, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Maybe," Corwin said, taking another step closer, "or maybe I should find out for myself." He reached for her, his hand closing around her wrist with bruising force. Elena's mind raced, searching for any way out, any escape from the cell, any weapon within reach. There was nothing. She was trapped, and Corwin was far stronger than any ordinary human, his shifter strength making her struggles feel useless against his grip. Panic clawed at her chest as he pulled her closer, his intentions clear in the way his eyes raked over her. Elena's mother's warnings echoed in her mind. Never use the power. Never reveal yourself. no matter what happens. But as Corwin's grip tightened, and his other hand reached for her, something inside Elena finally broke free from years of careful suppression. She felt it rise from deep within her chest, a heat that spread through her veins like fire, gathering behind her eyes until she felt them burn. Without thinking, without deciding, the words left her mouth in a tone that did not sound entirely like her own voice. Stop. The single word carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire cell, vibrating through the stone walls, through the air itself. Corwin froze instantly, his hand still outstretched, his entire body locking in place, as if invisible chains had suddenly wrapped around him. Elena stared at him in shock, her heart hammering against her ribs. Corwin's eyes had gone wide and glassy, his breathing shallow, his body trembling with the effort of trying to move against a force he could not understand. "Kneel," Elena whispered, the word slipping out before she could stop it, driven by instinct and desperation. Corwin's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor of the cell, his head bowing forward, as though an enormous weight had settled onto his shoulders. He knelt there, frozen, his eyes wide with confusion and something close to terror. Elena pressed her hand against her mouth, horrified at what she had just done. She had broken the one rule that had kept her alive for years. She had revealed herself, if only to a single guard, in a dark cell, deep beneath the palace. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, growing louder. Elena's pulse spiked with fresh panic. Someone was coming, drawn by the strange silence, or perhaps by some sound she had not noticed. She had only seconds to decide what to do. "You fell asleep," she said quickly to Corwin, her voice trembling but firm. "You dozed off on watch. Nothing happened here. You will remember nothing else." She had no idea if her words would hold any power over him beyond the initial command. No idea if a voice's influence could shape memory the way old stories claimed. But Corwin blinked slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, his expression shifting into something dazed and unfocused. The cell door swung open, and another guard peered inside, frowning at the sight of Corwin kneeling on the floor. "What in the world are you doing?" Corwin startled, scrambling to his feet with an embarrassed expression, rubbing at his eyes, as though he had genuinely just woken from sleep. "Sorry, must have dozed off for a moment. Long shift." The second guard rolled his eyes, muttering something about lazy dungeon duty, and gestured for Corwin to follow him out. Corwin cast one last glance back at Elena before leaving, his expression troubled, confused, searching for something he could not quite grasp. The door closed behind them, leaving Elena alone once more in the darkness. She sank down onto the straw, her whole body shaking, her mind racing with fear over what she had just done. She had used her power. She had broken her mother's most sacred rule. And somewhere out there, word might already be spreading about the strange behavior of a guard who had knelt before a supposedly wolfless prisoner. Elena did not sleep for the rest of that night. She sat against the cold stone wall, wrapping her arms around herself, wondering how long it would take before someone connected the dots, wondering if she had just signed her own death warrant. She had survived by hiding for years, but hiding, she realized with a sinking heart, might no longer be an option. Somewhere above her, in the highest tower of the palace, Alpha King Draven sat awake long after the rest of his court had gone to sleep, reviewing reports from his generals about troop movements along the northern border. He had no idea, not yet, that anything unusual had happened in his dungeons that night. He had no idea that the prisoner he had dismissed with barely a glance carried within her a power capable of shaking the foundations of his entire kingdom. But that would soon change. Rumors moved fast within the walls of the Crimson Moon Palace, faster than any messenger, faster than any official decree. By the time the sun rose the next morning, whispers about the strange incident in the dungeon had already begun spreading among the guards, though no one seemed to know exactly what had happened or why. Corwin himself could not explain it. He remembered standing in the cell, remembered reaching toward the prisoner, and then nothing at all, until his fellow guard found him kneeling on the ground, dazed and confused. He told everyone he had simply fallen asleep, embarrassed by his own carelessness, but deep down, something about the memory felt wrong. There was a gap in his mind, a missing piece he could not recover no matter how hard he tried. He mentioned it to another guard during breakfast, keeping his voice low. "I swear something happened in there. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment I was standing, and the next I was on my knees, and my whole body felt like it wasn't mine. The other guard laughed it off, assuming exhaustion had played tricks on his mind. But word travels through a palace, the way water travels through cracks in stone, finding paths no one expects, reaching ears no one intended. By midday, one of the senior guards mentioned the strange story to Kale, the king's most trusted enforcer and closest advisor. Kale was a broad-shouldered man, with sharp gray eyes, and a reputation for uncovering secrets that others tried to bury. He listened carefully to the account, his expression unreadable, before deciding the matter warranted further investigation. He made his way down to the dungeons himself that afternoon, moving through the dim corridors with the quiet confidence of a man who feared nothing within these walls. He found Elena's cell easily enough, the guard on duty pointing him toward the wolfless prisoner without much interest. Elena heard his footsteps long before he reached her cell, and she rose to her feet, bracing herself for whatever was about to happen. When Kale's face appeared through the small barred window in the door, she kept her expression carefully neutral, betraying none of the fear churning inside her. "I hear one of our guards had a strange experience near your cell last night," Kale said, his voice calm but probing. "Care to explain what happened?" "I was asleep," Elena said simply. "I don't know what the guard did or didn't experience. Perhaps you should ask him." Kale studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. Elena held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, refusing to let even a flicker of nervousness show through. She had spent years learning to hide her emotions, to present a calm surface no matter what storm raged beneath it, and she called upon every bit of that training now. "You don't seem particularly afraid," Kale observed. "Most prisoners tremble when I visit their cells." "Should I be afraid of you?" Elena asked, tilting her head slightly. A faint, almost amused expression crossed Kale's face. "Most people are." "I've faced worse things than an enforcer with sharp eyes," Elena said, and though she kept her tone even, there was truth buried in those words. She had faced hunters who wanted her dead. She had faced the loss of everything she loved. A single man with a stern face did not frighten her nearly as much as he seemed to expect. Kale did not press further that day, though Elena could tell from the way he lingered outside her cell, studying her with narrowed eyes, that he was not entirely satisfied with her answers. Eventually he left, his footsteps fading down the corridor, but Elena knew this was not the end of the matter. Men like Kale did not simply let mysteries go unsolved. Over the next several days, Elena noticed subtle changes in how she was treated. The guards seemed more watchful around her cell, their eyes lingering a moment longer than usual whenever they passed by. Her meals arrived a little more promptly, though the portions remained just as meager. It was as if an invisible spotlight had been turned in her direction, and though nothing dramatic had happened, she could feel the weight of increased attention pressing down on her. She spent long hours in the darkness turning over her options in her mind. She could try to escape, though the dungeon was heavily guarded, and she had no clear plan for getting past the palace walls, even if she managed to break free from her cell. She could continue to deny everything, hoping the strange incident with Corwin would eventually be forgotten as an isolated oddity. Or she could accept that her secret might not stay hidden much longer, and begin preparing herself for whatever came next. None of the options filled her with much confidence. On the 7th day after the incident, something happened that changed everything. Kale returned to the dungeon, but this time he was not alone. He brought with him 2 other guards, and a length of heavy rope, along with an expression far more serious than his previous visit. Elena's stomach tightened with dread as she watched them approach her cell. "The king has ordered a more thorough interrogation," Kale announced, unlocking her cell door. "There have been concerns raised about your presence here. We need to understand exactly what you are." "I already told you," Elena said, backing away as the guards entered the small space. "I'm Wolfless. There's nothing more to understand." "Then this should be a short conversation," Kale replied, though his tone suggested he did not believe her for a moment. They bound her wrists with the rope, far tighter than necessary, and led her out of the cell, and through a series of narrow corridors Elena had never seen before. She tried to memorize the path as they walked, some instinct telling her the information might prove useful later, though fear made it difficult to focus on anything beyond the pounding of her own heart. They brought her into a small stone chamber, empty except for a wooden chair bolted to the floor, and a single torch mounted on the wall. The guards forced her into the chair, securing the rope around her wrists to iron rings embedded in the armrests. Cale dismissed the other two guards, leaving only himself standing in the room with her. "Let's try this again," Cale said, circling the chair slowly. "Something happened to Corwin in your cell. He doesn't remember it clearly, but the way he described the sensation, feeling forced to kneel against his will, that isn't something that happens by accident. That isn't something a wolfless human can cause." Elena's mind raced, searching desperately for any lie convincing enough to satisfy him, but the truth was becoming harder to hide with each passing question. Cale was too observant, too experienced in uncovering deception, to be easily fooled by a simple denial. Maybe he was dreaming, Elena tried, though even to her own ears the excuse sounded weak. "Maybe," Cale said, though his tone made clear he did not believe it. He stopped his pacing and leaned down, bringing his face level with hers. "Or maybe you're something far more dangerous than a wolfless prisoner, and I intend to find out exactly what, before I report anything to the king." Elena felt her pulse quicken, the familiar heat beginning to build behind her eyes once again. She fought against it, clenching her jaw, forcing herself to stay silent, to keep the power buried where it belonged. She had already made one mistake. She could not afford another. But Cale was relentless. He questioned her, for what felt like hours, circling the same topics again and again from different angles, watching her reactions with the careful attention of a man who had interrogated countless prisoners before her. He asked about her family, her origins, the border she had been captured near, searching for any inconsistency in her story that might reveal the truth. Elena held firm, giving vague answers, deflecting whenever possible, but the strain of maintaining her composure for so long began to wear on her. Her wrists ached from the tightrope, her throat felt dry from hours without water, and still Cale pressed on, unwilling to accept anything less than the truth he was certain she was hiding. Finally, frustrated by her continued denials, Cale straightened and walked toward the door. "If you won't tell me the truth willingly, perhaps a different approach is needed. I'll return shortly, with someone who has other methods of extracting information." The threat hung heavy in the air as he left the room, the heavy door closing behind him with a final sounding thud. Elena sat alone in the chamber, her wrists bound, her heart pounding, fear coursing through her veins like ice water. She did not know what methods Cale intended to use, but she understood, with sudden clarity, that her time for hiding was running out. If they tortured her, if they pushed her to the edge of what she could endure, there was no guarantee she could keep her power contained. And if it revealed itself again, this time in front of someone as sharp and dangerous as Cale, there would be no explaining it away as sleepiness or dreams. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Elena strained against the rope, testing its strength, searching for any give in the knots, but the bindings held firm. She was well and truly trapped, with no clear way out, and no plan beyond simply hoping her power would not betray her again. When the door finally opened once more, it was not Cale who entered. It was the king himself. Elena's breath caught in her throat as Draven stepped into the small chamber, his presence filling the space in a way that made the walls feel even closer than before. He wore the same simple black clothing she remembered from the throne room, and his expression was unreadable, his dark eyes settling on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Cale tells me you've been giving him trouble," Draven said, his voice low and controlled as he closed the door behind him. Elena lifted her chin, refusing to let her fear show on her face despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I've told the truth. I don't know what more he wants from me." Draven moved closer, studying her with the same careful attention Cale had shown, though there was something different in his gaze, a sharpness, a focus that felt almost predatory. He crouched slightly, bringing himself to eye level with her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You're not afraid of me," he observed finally. "Every prisoner who sits in that chair trembles when I walk through that door. You haven't moved an inch." "Would trembling change anything?" Elena asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear churning beneath the surface. Something flickered in Draven's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a grudging kind of respect. "No," he admitted. "It wouldn't." He straightened again, crossing his arms as he studied her from a distance. "My enforcer believes you're hiding something significant. He's rarely wrong about these things, so I'll ask you directly, and I expect an honest answer. Elena's mind raced, weighing her options one final time. She could continue to lie, though she doubted it would hold much longer under this level of scrutiny. She could remain silent, though silence in the face of a direct question from the king himself carried its own dangers. Or she could tell some version of the truth, carefully measured, revealing just enough to survive this moment without exposing everything that made her vulnerable. "I am exactly what I told you," she said finally, choosing her words with careful precision. "A human without a wolf. Whatever happened with your guard, I cannot explain it any better than he can." Draven studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Elena held her breath, waiting to see whether her words would be enough. Finally, he turned toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "I don't believe you," he said simply, without anger, without threat, just a quiet statement of fact. "But I'm curious enough to give you one more chance to tell me the truth before this becomes something far less comfortable for you." He left the room without another word, leaving Elena alone once more, with her racing thoughts and the growing certainty that the walls she had built around her secret were beginning to crumble, piece by piece, no matter how hard she fought to hold them together. 3 days passed before Elena saw either Draven or Kale again, though the waiting did nothing to calm the storm of fear building inside her. She was kept in the same small chamber now instead of being returned to her cell, her wrists still bound loosely enough to allow some movement, but tight enough to remind her constantly of her captivity. Food and water were brought to her by a silent guard who refused to meet her eyes, and the isolation gave her far too much time to imagine everything that might come next. She thought often of her mother during those long hours, remembering the stories she used to tell about their family's history, tales passed down through generations of women who carried the same rare gift. Voices had once been protectors, her mother had explained, chosen guardians who used their power to prevent wars between rival packs, to stop bloodshed before it could spread. But fear had eventually turned admiration into hatred, and kingdoms across the land had united in the belief that no single person should hold such power over an entire species of shifters. The last known voice, according to her mother's stories, had been hunted down and killed nearly 300 years ago, her bloodline believed extinct ever since. Elena's own existence was proof that the bloodline had survived, hidden and scattered, passed down quietly through generations of women who understood that revealing their gift meant certain death. Now, trapped in the heart of the Crimson Moon Kingdom, Elena wondered if her family's careful secrecy was finally about to end in the very outcome her mother had spent her life trying to prevent. On the 4th day, the chamber door opened, and Kale entered once more, though this time his expression carried a grim determination that made Elena's stomach twist with dread. He was followed by 2 guards carrying various instruments Elena did not want to look at too closely, tools meant for extracting confessions from those unwilling to give them freely. "The king has grown tired of waiting for the truth," Kale said, his voice devoid of the careful neutrality he had shown during their previous conversation. "He's given me permission to use whatever methods necessary to determine exactly what you are." Elena's pulse spiked, panic clawing at the edges of her composure as the guards moved closer, their intentions clear. She had endured hardship before, had survived hunger and exhaustion, and the constant fear of discovery during her years on the run, but nothing had prepared her for the deliberate cruelty now approaching her in this small stone chamber. One of the guards reached for her arm, his grip tightening with clinical efficiency as he prepared to carry out whatever instructions Kale had given him. Elena's mind screamed at her to stay silent, to endure whatever came, to protect her secret at any cost. But as the guard's fingers dug painfully into her skin, and Kale watched with cold expectation, the careful control she had maintained for so long finally began to slip. "Wait," she gasped, the word escaping before she could stop it. Kale raised a hand, signaling the guard to pause, his sharp eyes fixed on Elena with renewed interest. "I'm listening." Elena's mind raced desperately, searching for some middle ground between the full truth and the lie she had maintained for so long, some explanation that might satisfy them without revealing the full extent of what she was. But before she could speak another word, the guard holding her arm suddenly yanked her forward with unnecessary force, and something inside her simply broke. The heat rose behind her eyes with startling speed, faster and more powerful than it had felt with Corwin in the dungeon, fueled by fear and desperation, and weeks of carefully suppressed panic finally reaching their breaking point. Elena felt the words gathering in her throat before she could stop them, felt the ancient power that had slept inside her family for generations, finally demanding release. "Release me," she said, and though her voice sounded no louder than before, it carried a weight that seemed to press against the very walls of the chamber. The guard holding her arm went utterly still, his fingers loosening instantly, his entire body freezing, as though an invisible hand had reached inside him and stopped every muscle from obeying his own will. His eyes went wide with confusion and fear, darting toward Cale, as if silently begging for an explanation he could not provide himself. Cale's expression shifted from cold determination to genuine shock as he watched the scene unfold before him. He had suspected something unusual about Elena, but nothing could have prepared him for witnessing the raw power now radiating from the young woman still bound to the chair. "Step back," Elena commanded, her voice trembling now with the effort of controlling something that had been suppressed for far too long. "All of you." The second guard stumbled backward immediately, his face pale with shock, while the first guard released her arm entirely and retreated toward the wall, his breathing ragged and uneven. Only Cale remained where he stood, watching Elena with an intensity that mixed fear with something that looked almost like fascination. "You're a voice," he said quietly, the realization settling over his features like a physical weight. "I didn't think any of you still existed." Elena said nothing, her chest heaving, as she fought to bring the power back under control, to push it back down into the depths where she had kept it hidden for so many years. The effort left her exhausted, her whole body trembling from the strain, and she slumped slightly against the ropes still binding her wrists. Cale turned to the two guards, his voice sharp with authority, despite the shock still evident on his face. "Leave us. Speak to no one about what you just witnessed. I will handle this personally." The guards did not hesitate, fleeing the chamber as quickly as their still shaking legs would carry them, leaving Cale alone with Elena once more. He approached slowly this time, his earlier aggression replaced by something far more cautious, far more calculating. "How is this possible?" he asked, crouching in front of her chair, studying her face, as though searching for answers written somewhere in her features. The voice bloodline was destroyed centuries ago. Every kingdom agreed on that law. Every history I've ever read confirms it. "Not every history is complete," Elena said quietly, too exhausted to maintain her earlier deflections. "My family hid for generations. My mother taught me to suppress this power my entire life. I never wanted to use it. I never intended for anyone to know." Cale studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Elena braced herself for whatever came next, certain that her secret's exposure would mean her immediate execution. Voices were feared precisely because of the power they held over shifters, a power that could turn armies against their own commanders, that could unravel entire kingdoms with nothing more than a spoken word. But instead of calling for guards, instead of drawing whatever weapon he carried, Cale simply sat back on his heels, considering her with an expression that had shifted from fear into something more complicated. "The king needs to know about this," he said finally. "Not the guards, not the court, just him, directly, before rumors spread and this becomes something none of us can control." "He'll have me executed," Elena said, the words coming out flatter than she intended, resignation settling over her despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "Perhaps," Cale admitted, his honesty somehow more unsettling than reassurance would have been. "But the king is not always predictable. He values strength and usefulness above blind adherence to old traditions. A voice, properly understood, could be seen as a weapon rather than merely a threat." Elena said nothing, uncertain whether Cale's words offered any real hope or simply a different flavor of danger. She had spent her entire life being taught that discovery meant death, and now that her secret had finally slipped free, she found herself unable to trust in any possibility beyond the fate she had always feared. Cale rose to his feet and moved toward the door, pausing briefly before leaving. "I'll speak with him tonight. Try to rest, if you can. Whatever happens next, it will happen quickly." He left the chamber, and Elena was alone once more, her wrists still bound, her body trembling from the aftermath of using her power twice in the span of a single week. She closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overwhelming the fear that had kept her alert for so many hours, and allowed herself a brief moment of stillness before whatever storm was coming finally arrived. That night, in his private chambers high above the dungeons, Draven listened to Cale's account of what had transpired, with an expression that gave away nothing of his internal thoughts. Cale described the scene in careful detail, the way the guard had frozen mid-motion, the strange weight carried by Elena's voice, the fear and awe that had gripped everyone present in that small stone chamber. A voice, Draven repeated, testing the word as though it tasted unfamiliar on his tongue. I thought the last of that bloodline died 3 centuries ago. So did every historian in every kingdom, Cale said, but I witnessed it myself. There's no other explanation for what that guard experienced. Draven rose from his chair and moved toward the window, staring out over the moonlit courtyard below, his mind working through the implications of what he had just learned. A voice within his own dungeon changed everything. Ancient law demanded execution, a tradition upheld by every kingdom for 300 years without exception. Rival pacts would view her existence as either a threat to be eliminated or a prize to be seized, and either possibility carried significant danger for his throne. And yet, Draven had spent his entire reign surrounded by wolves who obeyed him purely out of fear, who lowered their eyes and bent their knees, not out of respect, but out of terror at what defiance might cost them. He had grown accustomed to that dynamic, had even come to expect it as the natural order of things. But something about Elena's defiance during their brief encounters had struck him as different, unfamiliar, a kind of courage he rarely witnessed among his own subjects. Bring her to me, Draven said finally, turning away from the window. Not in chains. Not in that interrogation chamber. I want to speak with her properly, without an audience, before I decide anything. Cale raised an eyebrow slightly, though he knew better than to question the king's instructions directly. And if she attempts to use her power against you? Then I suppose we'll learn something important about the limits of her abilities, Draven said, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. Bring her tomorrow morning. I intend to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before this kingdom makes any irreversible decisions. Cale nodded and left to carry out the king's orders, leaving Draven alone with his thoughts once more. He stared out at the moon hanging low over his kingdom, turning over the strange turn of events in his mind, aware that whatever decision he made regarding Elena would shape the future of his reign in ways he could not yet fully predict. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Alpha King Draven found himself genuinely uncertain about what came next. Morning came too quickly for Elena, the pale light filtering through the small window of her chamber, pulling her from a restless, shallow sleep. Her wrists still ached from the rope binding them, and her body felt weak from days of stress and insufficient food. She barely had time to gather her thoughts before the door opened, and Cale stepped inside, his expression unreadable as always. "The king wants to see you," he said simply. Alone, in his private study. No chains this time, though I'd advise against giving him any reason to change that decision. Elena rose slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her after so many hours confined to the chair, and followed Cale out of the chamber, and through a series of corridors she had never seen before. The palace above the dungeons was a different world entirely, filled with light and warmth, tapestries depicting the kingdom's history hanging along polished stone walls, servants moving quietly about their duties without sparing her more than a curious glance. Cale led her to a heavy wooden door near the top of a winding staircase, knocking once before pushing it open and gesturing for Elena to enter. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, leaving her alone with the Alpha King for the first time. Draven's study was smaller than she had expected, lined with shelves of books and maps, a large window overlooking the kingdom's sprawling forests in the distance. He stood near that window when she entered, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, in a posture that somehow conveyed both patience and authority. "Sit," he said, without turning around, gesturing toward a chair near a modest wooden desk. Elena hesitated for a moment before complying, lowering herself into the chair, her body tense despite the absence of restraints. Draven finally turned to face her, studying her with the same intense focus she remembered from their previous encounters, though something in his expression seemed different now, less guarded perhaps, or simply more curious. "Cale tells me you're a voice," he said, moving to sit across from her at the desk. "A bloodline everyone believed had vanished centuries ago. I find myself needing to understand exactly what that means before I decide what to do with you." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hint of the anger or fear she had expected to find, but his expression remained calm, almost clinical in its curiosity. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Draven said simply. "How your power works, what its limits are, how your family survived when every other voice was hunted down and killed generations ago." Elena took a slow breath, weighing how much to reveal, aware that her survival likely depended on the answers she gave in the coming minutes. "My power lets me command the wolf inside any shifter, regardless of their rank or strength. A single word, spoken with true intention, can force even the strongest alpha to obey. My mother taught me to suppress it my entire life, to never let it surface no matter the circumstances. We moved constantly, never settling anywhere long enough for anyone to notice anything unusual about us. And yet it surfaced twice within your first month in my kingdom," Draven observed. "I was defending myself," Elena said, an edge of steel entering her voice, despite her attempt to remain calm. "Both times, I never intended for anyone to know what I am. I would have preferred to keep hiding indefinitely." Draven studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face, as though trying to determine the truth of her words, through sheer force of observation. "Every kingdom in this land has maintained the same law for 3 centuries. Any voice discovered within their borders is to be executed without trial, without exception. The fear surrounding your bloodline runs deep, Elena, deeper than you might realize." Elena's chest tightened at the casual way he used her name, at the calm manner in which he discussed her potential execution, as though weighing the merits of a business decision rather than a human life. "Then I assume that's what you intend to do." "I haven't decided yet," Draven said, and something in his tone made Elena look up sharply, surprised by the admission. "Every advisor I've consulted since last night has urged immediate execution, citing the ancient law and the danger your existence poses to my throne. A voice within my own dungeon, capable of commanding my own guards against me, is not something most kings would tolerate." "But you're not most kings," Elena said carefully, watching his reaction. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Draven's lips. "No, I am not." He rose from his chair and moved back toward the window, staring out at his kingdom once more, his hands clasped behind his back. "I've spent my entire reign surrounded by wolves who kneel out of fear rather than respect. Every command I give is obeyed instantly, not because my people believe in my judgment, but because they're terrified of the consequences should they disobey. It's an effective way to rule, but it grows exhausting after enough years, watching eyes drop the moment mine meet theirs, watching every conversation carefully measured for fear of offense." Elena said nothing, uncertain where this line of thought was leading, though something about his words resonated with a loneliness she recognized all too well from her own years of hiding. "You haven't looked away from me once since we met," Draven continued, turning back to face her. "Not in the throne room, not in that interrogation chamber, not even now, sitting unarmed in front of a man who could end your life with a single command to his guards. I find that curious." "Perhaps I've simply run out of fear," Elena said quietly, though the words felt more honest than she had intended them to be. "I've spent years running, hiding, watching my back every moment of every day. Being afraid of you specifically doesn't change much when I've already been afraid of everything else my entire life." Draven studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that Elena could not quite identify. "That's not the same as running out of fear," he said finally. "That sounds more like exhaustion." Elena felt a lump rise unexpectedly in her throat at his observation, surprised by how precisely he had identified the truth she had not fully acknowledged even to herself. She said nothing, unwilling to let him see how close his words had landed to something raw and unguarded within her. Draven returned to his seat across from her, folding his hands on the desk between them. "I have a proposal," he said. "Rather than execution, which my advisors would certainly prefer, I intend to keep you here within the palace, under close watch, while I determine the full extent of your abilities, and whether you pose an actual threat to my throne, or simply a perceived one." "And if I refuse?" Elena asked, though they both understood the question carried little real weight given her current circumstances. "You won't," Draven said, not unkindly, simply stating a fact both of them recognized as true. "You have nowhere else to go. No other protection against the kingdoms that would execute you the moment your identity became known. Whatever you think of my terms, they remain considerably better than any alternative currently available to you. Elena hated how accurate his assessment was, hated the way it stripped away any illusion of choice from her current situation. But she could not argue against the truth of his words. What exactly does this arrangement involve? You'll be given quarters within the palace, comfortable but closely guarded, Draven explained. You will not be permitted to leave the grounds without explicit permission. Kale will oversee your daily movements, and I expect complete honesty from you regarding your abilities and your history, both of which you've been rather selective about sharing thus far. And in exchange? Your life, Draven said simply. For now at least. Beyond that, I make no promises. Elena weighed his offer carefully, searching for hidden dangers within the arrangement, aware that trusting an Alpha King known throughout the land for his ruthlessness carried significant risks of its own. But the alternative, continued imprisonment in that small stone chamber, or worse, execution once her secret inevitably spread beyond Kale's knowledge, left her with little room to negotiate. I accept, she said finally, the words feeling heavier than she expected as they left her mouth. Draven nodded, apparently satisfied, though his expression revealed little of what he actually thought about the arrangement he had just proposed. Kale will show you to your new quarters. I expect you to remain there unless otherwise instructed, and I expect honesty going forward. Test my patience regarding either condition, and this arrangement will end swiftly. Elena rose from her chair, understanding the conversation had reached its conclusion, though countless questions remained unanswered in her mind. As she turned toward the door, Draven's voice stopped her one final time. Elena, he said, and something in the way he spoke her name made her pause and look back at him. For what it's worth, I don't believe you're the monster 3 centuries of history have painted your bloodline to be, but I intend to find out for certain before I decide anything further. Elena held his gaze for a long moment, uncertain how to respond to words that felt strangely close to reassurance from a man whose reputation suggested he offered such sentiments to no one. Finally, she simply nodded and left the study, her mind racing with everything that had just transpired. Kale waited for her outside the door, his expression carefully neutral as he led her through the palace toward her new quarters. Elena walked beside him in silence, processing the strange turn her circumstances had taken, uncertain whether the arrangement she had just accepted represented salvation or merely a different, more elaborate cage. Either way, for the first time since her capture, she found herself with something resembling a future beyond the walls of a dark cell. Whatever came next, she intended to face it with the same careful determination that had kept her alive through everything that came before. The quarters Kale led Elena to were unlike anything she had experienced in years. A modest room with a real bed, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking one of the palace's inner courtyards. It felt almost luxurious, compared to the dungeon cell she had occupied for weeks. 2 guards were stationed permanently outside her door, their presence a constant reminder that this arrangement, however comfortable, remained a form of captivity rather than genuine freedom. You'll take your meals here, Kale explained, showing her around the small space with brisk efficiency. You're permitted to walk in the eastern garden for an hour each morning, always accompanied by a guard. Beyond that, you remain within these quarters, unless the king summons you directly. Elena nodded, absorbing the boundaries of her new existence, grateful, despite everything, for the small comforts this arrangement offered, compared to what had come before. Thank you, she said quietly, and meant it, even knowing gratitude toward her captors felt strange and uncomfortable. Kale studied her for a moment, something almost sympathetic crossing his features before he schooled his expression back into its usual careful neutrality. The king is not a cruel man, whatever stories you may have heard about him. Difficult, certainly. Demanding, without question, but not cruel without reason. He left her alone after that, and Elena spent her first evening in the new quarters, simply sitting by the window, watching the sunset paint the courtyard below in shades of orange and gold, allowing herself a brief moment of something close to peace after weeks of constant fear. Over the following days, a strange routine began to take shape. Elena spent her mornings walking in the garden, always trailed by a silent guard who kept a respectful distance but never let her out of sight. Her afternoons were often interrupted by summons to Draven's study, where he questioned her extensively about her abilities, her family history, and the broader history of the voice bloodline as she understood it. These conversations, initially tense and guarded on both sides, gradually shifted into something Elena had not expected. Draven listened carefully to her answers, asking thoughtful follow-up questions, rather than simply extracting information for his own purposes. He seemed genuinely curious about her experiences, about the loneliness of a childhood spent constantly moving, always hiding, never able to form lasting friendships or a sense of permanent home. How did your mother teach you to suppress something so deeply rooted in who you are? Draven asked during one such conversation, several days into their arrangement. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. She taught me to think of it like a fire that needed careful tending. If I let it burn freely, it would consume everything around me, including myself. But if I kept it contained, fed it only enough to keep it from dying completely, I could control when and how it appeared. That sounds exhausting, Draven observed. It was, Elena admitted, surprised by how easily the honest answer came to her. Constant vigilance, every single day, for as long as I can remember. Never allowing myself to relax fully, never letting my guard down even for a moment. Draven was quiet for a while after that, his expression thoughtful as he studied her from across his desk. I understand something of that exhaustion myself, though for different reasons, he said finally. Every day, I must appear strong, decisive, untouchable. My court watches for any sign of weakness, any hesitation that rival packs might exploit. I haven't allowed myself a genuine moment of uncertainty in front of another living soul in longer than I can remember. Elena studied him carefully, surprised by the vulnerability in his admission, unexpected from a man whose reputation across the land suggested nothing but cold ruthlessness. Why tell me this? She asked. Draven considered the question for a long moment before answering. Perhaps because you're the first person in years who hasn't looked at me with either fear or blind obedience. It's strangely freeing to speak with someone who might actually understand, rather than simply comply. Something shifted between them in that moment, a fragile understanding beginning to form, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Elena found herself, against her better judgment, beginning to see the man behind the fearsome reputation, someone burdened by responsibilities he had never chosen, someone as isolated in his own way as she had been throughout her years on the run. Their conversations continued over the following weeks, gradually expanding beyond simple interrogation into something resembling genuine exchange. Draven told her about the pressures of ruling a kingdom surrounded by rival packs, about advisors who valued tradition over practical wisdom, about the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives with every choice he made. Elena shared fragments of her past she had never spoken aloud to anyone, memories of her mother's careful teachings, the fear that had shaped every year of her childhood, the grief of losing the only family she had ever known. Elena still could not fully trust him, aware that circumstances could shift at any moment, that Draven remained an Alpha King, with the power to end her life the instant he decided her usefulness had expired. But despite that lingering caution, she found herself looking forward to their conversations, appreciating the rare moments when she could speak honestly, without fear of immediate consequence. Kale, too, seemed to soften somewhat in his treatment of her as the weeks passed, though he remained professionally reserved in most of their interactions. He accompanied her on several of her morning walks personally, and during one such walk, he finally addressed the tension that had characterized their earlier encounters. "I owe you an apology," he said unexpectedly, as they walked along a gravel path lined with blooming flowers. "My interrogation methods were harsher than necessary. I was following protocol, but that doesn't excuse the fear I caused you." Elena studied him, surprised by the admission. "You were doing your job, protecting your king from a perceived threat." "Perhaps," Kale said, "but I've watched you these past weeks. You've shown remarkable restraint given everything you've endured. That says something about your character that I failed to consider when I first brought guards to that interrogation chamber." Elena accepted his apology with a small nod, appreciating the honesty even if it did not entirely erase the fear those early encounters had caused her. "Thank you for saying that." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, and Elena found herself genuinely enjoying Kale's company during their walks, appreciating his dry humor and the surprising depth of knowledge he possessed about the kingdom's history and geography. Slowly, cautiously, Elena began to feel something she had not experienced in years, a sense of belonging, however tenuous, within walls that had initially represented nothing but danger. But not everyone within the palace shared this growing acceptance. Word had begun to spread, despite Kale's efforts to contain the knowledge of Elena's true identity, and members of the royal court grew increasingly uneasy about the Wolfless prisoner, who now enjoyed private meetings with their king. Whispers followed her whenever she walked through palace corridors, and Elena noticed the way certain nobles watched her with poorly concealed suspicion and fear. One evening, as she returned from her garden walk, Elena overheard a conversation between two nobles that made her stomach tighten with renewed anxiety. "The king has lost his senses," one voice muttered, barely audible through a partially open door. Keeping a voice within these walls, allowing her private audiences, is an invitation for disaster. If word spreads to rival packs, they'll see it as either a weapon to be stolen or a weakness to be exploited. "Someone should speak with him," the second voice replied, "before this arrangement puts the entire kingdom at risk." Elena hurried past the door before they could notice her presence, her heart pounding with fresh worry. The peace she had begun to find within these palace walls suddenly felt far more fragile than she had allowed herself to believe, threatened not only by the ancient laws demanding her execution, but also by the very court surrounding the king who had chosen, for reasons still unclear even to Elena herself, to protect her instead. That night, unable to sleep, Elena stood by her window staring out at the moonlit courtyard, wondering how long this fragile arrangement could possibly last, before the pressures surrounding Draven forced his hand toward a very different decision. She thought of her mother's warnings, of the countless generations of voices who had been hunted and killed for simply existing, and wondered whether she had merely delayed the inevitable rather than truly escaped it. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it cautiously, to find Draven standing in the corridor, his expression troubled in a way she had not seen during their previous conversations. "I heard about the concerns being raised among my court," he said without preamble, stepping into her room once she gestured him inside. "I wanted you to hear the truth from me directly, rather than through whispers and rumors." Elena's chest tightened with fresh apprehension. "What truth?" "That I intend to continue protecting you, regardless of what my advisors believe is wise," Draven said, his voice carrying a firmness that surprised her. "But I also intend to be honest about the risks that decision carries, for both of us. My court is not wrong to raise concerns. Rival packs would indeed see your existence as either a threat or an opportunity, and either possibility could destabilize this kingdom in ways I cannot fully predict." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hint of the anger or fear she had expected given the circumstances, but found only weary determination in his expression. "Then why continue protecting me at all?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "Because I've come to believe you're not the danger my advisors fear," he said finally. "And because, for reasons I'm still working to understand myself, I find that I don't want to be the man who sends you to your death simply because tradition demands it." The admission hung heavy in the air between them, carrying weight far beyond its simple words. Elena felt something shift within her chest, a fragile warmth she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember, tempered by the knowledge that danger still surrounded them both from every direction. "Thank you," she said quietly, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Draven nodded, though his expression remained troubled as he turned to leave. "Rest well, Elena. Tomorrow, I intend to address my court directly about this matter, before rumors grow into something far more dangerous than the truth itself." He left her alone once more, and Elena stood by her window long into the night, watching the moon traverse the sky, wondering what the coming days would bring for both of them, and cautiously allowing herself to hope that perhaps, against all odds, she had found something resembling safety within the walls of the very kingdom that should have destroyed her on sight. The following morning, Draven called an emergency meeting of his royal council, gathering the kingdom's most influential nobles and advisors within the great hall, where Elena had first stood before him weeks earlier as an anonymous prisoner. Elena remained in her quarters during the meeting, too anxious to focus on anything beyond wondering what was being decided about her fate in that grand hall she could not see. Inside the council chamber, tension filled the air, as Draven took his place at the head of the long table, his expression composed, despite the weight of the conversation he was about to initiate. Around him sat a dozen of the kingdom's most powerful figures, including his eldest advisor, a stern woman named Isolde who had served 3 generations of the royal bloodline, and Bastian, a broad-shouldered general responsible for overseeing the kingdom's military forces. "You've all heard the rumors by now," Draven began, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "I intend to address them directly, rather than allow speculation to continue spreading unchecked. The prisoner known as Elena is indeed a voice, the last known survivor of a bloodline our kingdom's laws demand be executed on discovery." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council, though none dared interrupt their king directly. Isolde spoke first, her voice sharp with barely concealed alarm. "Then the law is clear, Your Majesty. She must be executed immediately, before this becomes a crisis beyond our control." "I disagree," Draven said simply, and the hall fell into stunned silence at his blunt refusal to follow tradition that had stood unquestioned for 3 centuries. "I have spent considerable time observing her these past weeks. She poses no threat to this kingdom that I have witnessed. Her power, while significant, has been used only in self-defense against those who threatened her directly." "With respect, Your Majesty," Bastian interjected, his tone carrying the careful diplomacy of a seasoned military commander. "The danger a voice represents extends beyond immediate threats to her own safety. If rival pacts learn of her existence within these walls, they will either demand her execution as tradition requires, or worse, attempt to seize her for their own purposes. A voice commanding an enemy army against us would be catastrophic." Draven considered this argument carefully, aware of its validity despite his growing certainty that Elena herself posed no inherent danger. "Then we ensure her existence remains contained within these walls, known only to those present in this room, until I've determined the full scope of the situation." "And if word spreads regardless?" Isolde pressed. "Secrets rarely remain buried within a palace this size, Your Majesty. You know this as well as any of us." "Then we address that risk, when and if it materializes," Draven replied, his tone leaving little room for further argument. "For now, my decision stands. Elena remains under my protection, and this matter is not to be discussed beyond the walls of this chamber." The council members exchanged uneasy glances, and though several looked prepared to voice further objections, none dared openly challenge their king's direct command. The meeting continued for another hour, covering various logistical concerns about maintaining secrecy and managing the kingdom's ongoing tensions with neighboring territories. But Draven's core decision regarding Elena's fate remained unshaken, despite the council's evident discomfort. News of the meeting's outcome eventually reached Elena through Kale, who visited her quarters that evening, with a carefully measured account of what had transpired. The king held firm, he told her, settling into the chair near her window, though not without significant resistance from several council members. Elena absorbed this information with mixed emotions, grateful for Draven's continued protection, but deeply aware of the precarious position it placed him in with his own advisors. "This puts him at risk," she said quietly. "Doesn't it? Defending me against his own council's wishes." "It does," Kale admitted honestly. "Kings who ignore the counsel of their advisors too often find themselves facing rebellion, or, at minimum, a significant erosion of support when they need it most. Draven understands this risk better than anyone, yet he chose to accept it regardless." "Why would he do that?" Elena asked, though part of her already suspected an answer she was not entirely ready to acknowledge. Kale studied her for a long moment before responding, his expression thoughtful. "I've served this king for many years, Elena. I've watched him make countless difficult decisions, weighing political consequences against personal conviction, time and again. Rarely have I seen him choose personal conviction so decisively against the near-unanimous counsel of his advisors." Elena said nothing, uncertain how to process the implication behind Kale's words, though a warmth she could not entirely suppress settled in her chest at the thought of Draven choosing to protect her despite such significant personal cost. Over the following weeks, life within the palace settled into a new rhythm, though an undercurrent of tension remained ever present beneath the surface of daily routines. Elena continued her morning walks in the garden, her afternoon conversations with Draven growing longer and more personal, as trust between them slowly deepened. Kale remained a steady, reassuring presence, gradually becoming something closer to a friend than the intimidating enforcer she had first encountered in that dark interrogation chamber. But whispers continued to circulate among certain factions of the court, and Elena remained acutely aware that not everyone shared Draven's growing acceptance of her presence within the palace. She caught glimpses of nobles watching her with poorly concealed distrust during rare occasions when her path crossed with the wider court, and she overheard fragments of conversations, suggesting some among the council continued pressing Draven privately to reconsider his decision. One afternoon, during a walk through the garden, Elena noticed a young noblewoman watching her with particular intensity from a nearby balcony. The woman's expression carried none of the fear or curiosity Elena had grown accustomed to from others within the palace, but rather something closer to calculated interest, as though she were assessing Elena for some purpose beyond simple observation. "Who is that?" Elena asked her guard quietly, nodding toward the balcony. The guard glanced up, his expression shifting slightly. "Lady Cassia, one of the king's most persistent suitors, though he's shown little interest in her advances thus far. She comes from a powerful allied pack in the northern territories." Elena filed this information away, uncertain why the detail felt significant, but sensing instinctively that Lady Cassia's interest in her presence extended beyond simple curiosity about the palace's newest and most unusual resident. That evening, during her regular conversation with Draven in his study, Elena mentioned the encounter, watching his reaction carefully. His expression shifted subtly at the mention of Lady Cassia's name, something guarded entering his features that Elena had not seen during their more recent conversations. "Lady Cassia's family has long sought closer ties with the throne," Draven explained carefully. "Her interest in you likely stems from concern about how your presence here might affect the political landscape she's hoping to navigate. Should I be worried about her?" Elena asked directly, appreciating that their growing familiarity allowed for such blunt questions. Draven considered this for a moment before answering. Perhaps cautious would be a more accurate term than worried. Lady Cassia is ambitious and well-connected. If she perceives you as an obstacle to her own goals, she may attempt to undermine your position here through whatever means available to her. Elena absorbed this warning with growing unease, aware that the fragile safety she had begun to feel within the palace walls remained far more precarious than she had allowed herself to believe. Between the ancient laws demanding her execution, the council members who continued questioning Draven's judgment, and now the added complication of a politically ambitious noblewoman who might view her as a threat, Elena's situation felt increasingly like a delicate balance that could shatter at any moment. "I don't want to be the reason your throne becomes unstable," Elena said quietly, voicing a fear that had been building within her for weeks. "If my presence here creates too much risk, perhaps it would be better for both of us if I left." Draven's expression shifted immediately, something firm and unwavering entering his voice as he responded. "That's not a decision I'm willing to consider, Elena. Whatever risks my protection of you creates, I've weighed them carefully, and I stand by my choice." "You are not merely a political complication to be discarded when convenient." The intensity behind his words caught Elena off guard, and she studied him carefully, searching for the meaning behind such firm conviction. Something had shifted between them over these past weeks, evolving from wary captivity into something far more complicated, and Elena found herself uncertain how to navigate the unfamiliar territory of feelings she had never expected to develop toward the Alpha King, who had once dismissed her so casually as unworthy of his attention. "Thank you," she said finally, unable to find more adequate words for the moment. Draven held her gaze for a long moment before nodding, the intensity in his expression softening slightly. "We'll navigate whatever challenges arise together, Elena. I don't intend to abandon that commitment, regardless of what obstacles my court or anyone else places in our path." Elena left his study that evening with a strange mixture of comfort and continued apprehension, aware that Draven's firm commitment to protecting her, however reassuring, did nothing to eliminate the very real dangers still surrounding them both. Somewhere within the palace, and likely beyond its walls as well, forces were already gathering that would test the strength of that commitment far more severely than either of them yet realized. 2 weeks after the council meeting that had cemented Draven's decision to protect her, Elena found herself increasingly woven into the daily fabric of palace life, though always within carefully defined boundaries. Her conversations with Draven had become a fixture of each evening, stretching later into the night, as topics ranged from kingdom politics to lighter subjects neither of them had expected to discuss so freely with the other. One evening, as autumn winds began sweeping through the palace courtyards, Draven surprised her by suggesting they walk together in the garden, rather than remain confined to his study. Elena agreed readily, grateful for the change of scenery, and they strolled along familiar gravel paths, while a single guard trailed at a respectful distance behind them. "You seem different tonight," Elena observed, noticing a slight tension in Draven's shoulders that had not been present during their recent conversations. Draven was quiet for a moment before responding. "Reports arrived today from our northern border. Shadowfang scouts have been spotted more frequently along the boundary lines than usual. Their pack has grown increasingly aggressive in recent months, and I suspect they're testing our defenses in preparation for something larger." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The Shadowfang pack. "I've heard whispers about them from the guards. They're not allied with your kingdom." "Far from it," Draven confirmed, his expression darkening. "They've long coveted territory along our shared border, and their alpha has grown increasingly bold as his pack's strength has expanded through conquest of smaller territories. I've been monitoring the situation closely, though I hadn't intended to burden you with these concerns." "I'd rather know," Elena said firmly, "especially if it concerns danger that might eventually reach these walls." Draven glanced at her, something like appreciation crossing his features at her directness. "Fair enough. I'll keep you informed going forward, rather than shielding you from concerns that may prove relevant to your own safety, as well as the kingdom's." They continued walking in comfortable silence for a while, the tension from their earlier conversation gradually easing as they discussed lighter topics. Elena's growing familiarity with the palace's layout, a particularly stubborn rosebush that refused to bloom despite the gardener's best efforts, a humorous incident involving one of the kitchen staff, and an overly curious palace cat. As they reached a secluded corner of the garden, shielded from view by tall hedges, Draven stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that made her pause. "I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer." "Of course," she said, curiosity mixing with slight apprehension at his sudden change in tone. "Do you regret the circumstances that brought you here?" he asked. "Being captured, imprisoned, forced into this arrangement, neither of us could have anticipated when you first arrived in my kingdom." Elena considered the question carefully, surprised by its unexpected vulnerability. "I regret the fear," she said finally. "The uncertainty, the danger that still surrounds both of us. But I don't regret." She paused, searching for the right words. "I don't regret coming to know you, or Kale, or finding something resembling stability, after years of running with nowhere to call home." Draven studied her face in the fading evening light, something unguarded in his expression that she had rarely glimpsed during their earlier interactions. "I find myself grateful for circumstances I never would have chosen, for reasons that continue to surprise me," he admitted quietly. The air between them felt charged with unspoken meaning, and Elena's heart quickened as Draven took a step closer, his dark eyes searching her face, as though seeking permission for something neither of them had yet put into words. She did not step back. "I've ruled this kingdom for years," Draven continued, his voice lower now, more intimate than she had ever heard it. "I've made countless decisions, weighing political consequence against personal desire, and personal desire has always lost that battle. Until now." Elena's breath caught in her throat as understanding dawned regarding the direction of his words. "Draven," she said softly, uncertain what she intended to say next, but unwilling to interrupt whatever moment was unfolding between them. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing gently against her cheek, and Elena found herself leaning into the touch despite every instinct that had spent years teaching her caution above all else. "You've shown me something I'd forgotten existed," Draven said quietly. "A conversation without fear, a connection without obligation. I don't know what to call what's grown between us these past weeks, but I know I don't want it to end." "Neither do I," Elena admitted, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing as she spoke them aloud for the first time. Draven's expression softened further, something close to relief crossing his features before he leaned down, closing the remaining distance between them. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative at first, as though both of them remained uncertain about crossing this particular threshold, despite the pull that had been building between them for weeks. But the hesitation faded quickly, replaced by something warmer and more certain, as Elena's hands found their way to his shoulders and his arms wrapped carefully around her. When they finally parted, Elena felt breathless, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and lingering apprehension about what this new development might mean for both of them going forward. "This complicates things," she said softly, though a smile tugged at her lips despite the truth of her words. "Considerably," Draven agreed, though his own expression carried none of the concern the word might have suggested. "My council will have opinions about this development that I suspect will not be favorable." "Do you care?" Elena asked, studying his face carefully. Draven considered the question seriously before answering. "Less than I probably should, given my responsibilities as king, but I've spent enough years prioritizing everyone else's expectations above my own desires. I find myself unwilling to sacrifice this particular happiness simply because it proves politically inconvenient." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, though the practical concerns that had shadowed their entire relationship thus far had not disappeared simply because of one significant moment in a quiet garden. "We'll need to be careful," she said. "For both our sakes. Lady Cassia and others like her won't take kindly to this news, and the risks we discussed before haven't diminished simply because we've acknowledged our feelings." "Agreed," Draven said, though his hand found hers as they resumed their walk back toward the palace, a small gesture that felt significant given everything it represented about the shift in their relationship. "But I intend to face those challenges as they arise, rather than allowing fear of them to prevent me from acknowledging what I've come to feel for you." They walked back through the garden in comfortable silence, both of them aware that the conversation they had just shared marked a significant turning point in their relationship, one that carried both promise and considerable risk in equal measure. As they approached the palace entrance, Elena noticed a figure watching them from a shadowed archway, quickly retreating from view as they drew closer. "Did you see that?" she asked Draven quietly, uncertainty creeping back into her voice. Draven's expression sharpened, his earlier warmth replaced by immediate alertness. "Someone was watching us." "Lady Cassia?" Elena asked, though she had not gotten a clear enough look to confirm the figure's identity. "Possibly," Draven said, his jaw tightening slightly. "Or perhaps simply a servant going about their duties. Either way, we should be more careful about where we choose to have such conversations going forward." Elena nodded, the earlier warmth of their moment together tempered now by renewed awareness of the dangers surrounding them both. As they parted ways for the evening, Draven returning to his study and Elena to her quarters, she found herself hoping desperately that whoever had witnessed their moment in the garden would not use that knowledge against them in ways that could unravel everything they had carefully built over these past weeks. That hope, unfortunately, would prove far too optimistic for the challenges that lay ahead. The following days passed without incident, though Elena remained watchful, unable to shake the unease that had settled over her since spotting the mysterious figure in the garden archway. Draven, too, seemed more cautious in his interactions with her, their evening conversations still occurring regularly, but with a heightened awareness of their surroundings that had not been present before. Nearly a week after their moment in the garden, Elena woke earlier than usual, disturbed by a strange restlessness she could not quite explain. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the eastern garden for her morning walk, accompanied as always by her assigned guard, a quiet young man named Fenwick who had grown accustomed to her routine over the past several weeks. The garden felt different that morning, the usual birdsong noticeably absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness that made the hair on Elena's arms stand on end. She glanced toward Fenwick, wondering if he sensed the same unease, and found his expression tense, his eyes scanning the surrounding hedges with obvious alertness. "Something feels wrong," Elena murmured, slowing her pace. Fenwick nodded slightly, his hand drifting toward the sword at his hip. "I feel it too. We should return to the palace." But before they could turn back, movement flickered at the edge of Elena's vision, and three figures emerged from behind a cluster of tall hedges, their postures immediately marking them as trained fighters rather than palace staff. Elena's heart lurched with sudden fear as she recognized the distinctive gray and black markings on their clothing, the colors of the Shadowfang pack. Run, Fenwick said sharply, already moving to position himself between Elena and the approaching intruders, his sword drawn with practiced speed. Elena hesitated for only a moment before turning to flee back toward the palace, her heart pounding as she heard the sounds of a struggle erupting behind her. She had taken only a few steps when a fourth figure emerged directly in her path, cutting off her escape route with terrifying efficiency. The voice, the figure said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Elena's blood run cold. Our Alpha will be very pleased. Elena backed away instinctively, her mind racing through possibilities as the intruder advanced toward her with predatory confidence. She could hear Fenwick still fighting somewhere behind her, the clash of steel and low growls suggesting the battle was far from over, but she could not spare attention for his struggle when her own immediate safety remained so precarious. "Stay back," she warned, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her attempt to sound commanding. The intruder laughed, clearly unimpressed by her warning. "You think mere words will stop me? I've heard the stories, girl, but I don't believe a single command from someone as frightened as you poses any real threat." He lunged toward her suddenly, and Elena's instincts took over before conscious thought could catch up. The familiar heat rose behind her eyes with startling speed, fueled by genuine terror, rather than the more controlled anger that had triggered her power in previous encounters. "Stop," she commanded, pouring every ounce of desperate intention into the single word. The intruder froze mid-motion, his outstretched hand hanging in the air, mere inches from Elena's shoulder, his entire body locked in place, as though invisible restraints had suddenly wrapped around him. His eyes went wide with shock and confusion, and Elena could see the internal struggle playing out across his features as he fought uselessly against a command his own wolf could not resist. "Release your weapon," Elena continued, her confidence growing slightly as she witnessed the immediate effect of her power. "Kneel." The intruder's sword clattered to the ground, and he sank slowly to his knees, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief at finding himself so completely under her control, despite every instinct urging him to fight back. Elena did not have time to process her success before more shouting erupted from further within the garden, and she turned to see additional guards arriving, drawn by the sounds of the earlier struggle. Fenwick emerged from behind a hedge, breathing heavily but apparently uninjured, having successfully fended off the other two attackers, who now lay unconscious or restrained on the ground nearby. "Elena," Draven's voice cut through the chaos, and she turned to see him rushing toward her, his expression a mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness that made her chest tighten despite the danger still surrounding them. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Elena managed, though her whole body still trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline and the effort of maintaining her command over the kneeling intruder. "But there were 4 of them. Shadowfang, I think." Draven's expression darkened immediately as he took in the scene before him, his eyes moving between the restrained intruders and the guard's obviously injured but functional state. "This confirms what I feared," he said grimly, turning to address the gathering guards. "Secure these prisoners immediately. I want them questioned separately, and I want to know exactly how they gained access to these grounds without detection." The guards moved swiftly to carry out his orders, binding the intruders with heavy rope and leading them away toward the palace's own dungeons. Elena finally allowed her power to release its hold, watching the kneeling man slump forward slightly, his expression dazed, as the compulsion lifted from his mind. Draven turned to her once the immediate danger had passed, his hands settling gently on her shoulders as he studied her face with obvious concern. "You saved lives here today," he said quietly. "Yours and Fenwick's both, from the look of things." "They knew what I was," Elena said, her voice still shaking slightly. "They came here specifically looking for me." "Which confirms that word of your presence here has indeed reached beyond these walls," Draven said grimly, his jaw tightening with barely suppressed anger. "The Shadowfang pack has long sought any advantage against my throne. Learning of a voice under my protection would be exactly the kind of opportunity their Alpha would seek to exploit." Elena felt a fresh wave of fear at the implications of his words, understanding that this attack likely represented only the beginning of threats that would follow, now that her existence had become known beyond the palace walls. "What happens now?" Draven's expression hardened with determination. "Now we ensure this kingdom understands exactly what kind of threat we're facing, and exactly how capable you are of defending yourself and those around you against it. This attack, as frightening as it was, may prove useful in changing minds that have thus far remained resistant to accepting your place within these walls." Elena was not entirely certain what he meant by that statement, but the immediate concern of processing what had just happened left little room for further questions. Draven guided her back toward the palace, his arm remaining protectively around her shoulders despite the guards and other palace staff who had gathered to witness the aftermath of the attack. Word of the attempted attack spread quickly through the palace over the following hours, and by evening, the entire court had gathered in the Great Hall, summoned by Draven to address the incident directly. Elena stood near the throne, still shaken from the morning's events, as Draven addressed his assembled advisors and nobles with a firmness that left little room for argument. "Today, agents of the Shadowfang Pack infiltrated our grounds with the specific intention of capturing or eliminating the woman under my protection," Draven announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "This confirms what several of you have feared, that knowledge of her presence here has reached beyond our walls. However, I would remind this council that it was Elena's own abilities, combined with the bravery of one of our guards, that prevented this attack from succeeding." Murmurs rippled through the assembled court, and Elena could see mixed expressions among the nobles, some still carrying obvious suspicion and fear, others regarding her with newfound curiosity, or even grudging respect for her role in repelling the attack. Lady Cassia, standing near the front of the assembled nobles, spoke up with carefully measured concern. "Your Majesty, while I understand the value she demonstrated today, doesn't this attack simply confirm the danger her presence brings to our kingdom? If the Shadowfang were willing to send agents directly into our grounds once, what prevents them from attempting something far more significant in the future?" "A fair concern," Draven acknowledged, though his tone made clear he had already anticipated such objections. "Which is precisely why I intend to strengthen our defenses considerably in the coming weeks, and why I believe Elena's abilities represent an asset to this kingdom's security, rather than merely a liability to be feared." The council chamber fell into uneasy silence, as Draven's words settled over the assembled court, and Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes studying her with renewed consideration. Whatever fragile acceptance she had begun to build within these walls over the past weeks had just been fundamentally altered by the morning's events, though whether that alteration would ultimately work in her favor or against it remained an open question that only time would answer. The days following the Shadowfang attack brought a tense, watchful energy to the palace that Elena could feel in every corridor she walked. Guards had been doubled at every entrance, and Draven spent long hours closeted with his generals, reviewing defenses and discussing the growing threat along the northern border. Elena, though grateful for the increased security, found herself increasingly restless, aware that the danger surrounding her had not diminished simply because one attack had been repelled. Interrogations of the captured Shadowfang agents yielded troubling information. Under careful questioning, one of the intruders revealed that his alpha, a ruthless leader named Roland, had learned of Elena's presence through a spy embedded somewhere within the Crimson Moon Palace itself. The revelation sent a fresh wave of unease through Draven's court, as suspicion fell upon various members of the staff and nobility who might have leaked such sensitive information to a rival pack. "We need to find this spy quickly," Kale told Draven and Elena during a private meeting in the king's study, his expression grim. "If Roland learned of Elena's presence once, he'll continue receiving updates about our defenses and plans until we root out whoever is providing that information." "Any suspects?" Draven asked, his fingers drumming against the desk with barely contained frustration. "Several," Kale admitted, though nothing conclusive yet. Lady Cassia's household has connections to several northern territories that maintain uneasy relationships with the Shadowfang Pack, though that alone proves nothing definitive. Elena listened to this exchange with growing unease, aware that the political complexity surrounding her situation had grown far beyond what she had originally anticipated when she first accepted Draven's arrangement weeks earlier. What had begun as a simple question of her own survival had evolved into a matter threatening the stability of an entire kingdom. "Perhaps I should leave," Elena said quietly, voicing a thought that had been building within her since the attack. "If my presence here continues to create this level of danger, perhaps it would be better for everyone if I simply disappeared, found somewhere else to hide." "Absolutely not," Draven said immediately, his tone leaving no room for argument. Whatever spy is feeding information to Roland, sending you away now, would only confirm that fear and intimidation can force my hand. That's not a precedent I'm willing to set, for my kingdom or for us personally. Cale nodded in agreement, though his expression remained troubled. Besides, running would not guarantee your safety. Roland has clearly demonstrated a willingness to send agents beyond his own territory to capture you. Fleeing without proper protection would likely place you in even greater danger than remaining here under the king's protection. Elena reluctantly accepted the validity of their arguments, though the weight of responsibility for the danger surrounding the palace continued to press heavily on her conscience. Over the following days, she found herself withdrawing somewhat, spending more time alone in her quarters, uncertain how to reconcile her growing feelings for Draven with the very real danger her presence continued to represent for everyone around her. Draven noticed her withdrawal and made a point of seeking her out during a quiet evening, nearly a week after the attack, finding her sitting by her window, staring out at the darkening courtyard with a troubled expression. "You've been distant," he observed, settling into the chair near her window without waiting for invitation. "I understand the pressure you're feeling, but isolating yourself won't make the danger disappear. I just keep thinking about what might have happened if Fenwick hadn't been with me that morning, or if my power hadn't responded quickly enough. People could have died because of what I am. People risk their lives every day defending this kingdom against countless threats," Draven said gently. "That's the nature of the world we live in, Elena. You didn't create the danger from the Shadowfang pack. Roland's ambition existed long before you ever arrived here." Elena appreciated his attempt at reassurance, though the guilt continued gnawing at her regardless. What if this is only the beginning? What if Roland sends more agents, or worse, brings his entire pack against your kingdom, specifically to capture me? Draven's expression grew serious as he considered her question. "Then we face that threat together, with every resource this kingdom possesses. I've already begun strengthening our alliances with neighboring territories, and our own defenses grow stronger by the day. Whatever comes, Elena, I don't intend to face it without you by my side." The sincerity in his words offered some comfort, though the underlying tension of their situation remained unresolved. Their conversation shifted to other topics as the evening wore on, and gradually, Elena felt some of her earlier anxiety ease in the familiar comfort of Draven's company, though the shadow of the ongoing threat never fully disappeared from her thoughts. Nearly 2 weeks after the initial attack, the situation reached a critical turning point. Reports arrived at the palace, indicating that Roland's forces had begun massing along the northern border in numbers far exceeding typical territorial disputes. Draven called an emergency council meeting, and this time, he insisted Elena attend alongside him rather than remaining confined to her quarters. The scale of this mobilization suggests Roland intends something far more significant than another covert attempt to capture Elena, Bastion reported grimly, spreading a detailed map across the council table. "Our scouts estimate his forces at nearly triple what we would expect for a simple border skirmish." "He's preparing for war," Draven said, his expression hardening as he studied the map, using Elena's presence here as justification to finally act on ambitions he's held for years regarding our northern territories. The council chamber erupted into anxious discussion, various advisors offering different strategies for defending against the coming threat. Elena listened carefully, understanding the gravity of the situation growing more apparent with each passing report, and feeling the familiar weight of guilt settling over her once again, despite Draven's earlier reassurances. As the meeting continued, tempers began to flare among the council members, with several advisors returning to their earlier arguments about the wisdom of continuing to protect Elena, given the mounting evidence that her presence had directly triggered this looming conflict. Lady Cassia, in particular, grew increasingly vocal in her objections. "Your Majesty, I understand your personal feelings regarding this matter," she said, her tone carrying barely concealed frustration, "but we cannot allow sentiment to override the clear evidence before us. Roland's forces mass at our border, directly because of her continued presence within these walls. How many soldiers must die defending a decision driven by personal attachment rather than sound political judgment?" The chamber fell into tense silence at her bold accusation, and Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, uncertain whether from embarrassment or anger at being discussed as though she were not present in the room. Before Draven could respond, however, Elena found herself rising from her seat, driven by a sudden determination to address the growing crisis directly, rather than allowing others to continue debating her fate as though she had no voice in the matter herself. "If I may speak," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber, despite the nervousness churning in her stomach. Draven nodded slightly, giving her the floor, and the assembled council turned their attention toward her, with varying expressions of curiosity, suspicion, and grudging interest. "I understand the fear my presence here has created," Elena began, choosing her words carefully. "I understand that Roland sees me as either a prize to be captured or a threat to be eliminated, and that his ambitions now threaten this entire kingdom because of that perception. But I am not merely a passive threat, waiting to bring destruction upon all of you. I am also someone capable of defending this kingdom, if given the trust and opportunity to do so." "With respect," Bastian interjected, though his tone carried less hostility than Lady Cassia's earlier remarks. "One woman's abilities, however unusual, cannot single-handedly repel an army the size Roland appears to be assembling." "Perhaps not alone," Elena agreed, "but my power extends to any shifter, regardless of their pack allegiance or rank. If Roland brings his forces against this kingdom, I am capable of turning that army against its own commander, of ending this conflict before it costs a single additional life among your soldiers." The council chamber fell silent as the implications of her words settled over the assembled advisors. Elena continued, her voice growing steadier with each word as conviction replaced her earlier nervousness. "I did not choose this power, and I spent most of my life trying to hide it from a world that has only ever taught me to fear its discovery. But I am done hiding. If this kingdom will trust me, I intend to prove that a voice can be a protector rather than merely a danger to be feared, exactly as my ancestors once were, before fear turned admiration into persecution." Draven watched her with an expression of fierce pride, and even several skeptical council members appeared visibly moved by the conviction behind her words. Lady Cassia, though her expression remained guarded, said nothing further to challenge Elena's declaration. "Then let us prepare accordingly," Draven said finally, rising from his seat with renewed determination. "We will meet Roland's forces at our border, and Elena will stand with us, not as a prisoner to be hidden away, but as a defender of this kingdom she has chosen to protect." The council chamber buzzed with renewed energy as preparations for the coming conflict began in earnest, and Elena felt a profound shift within herself, the weight of years spent hiding finally beginning to lift as she embraced, for the first time in her life, the full truth of what she was capable of becoming. The following days passed in a blur of preparation as the Crimson Moon Kingdom readied itself for the confrontation gathering along its northern border. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards from dawn until dusk. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly forging additional weapons, and Draven met continuously with his generals, refining strategies that now accounted for Elena's unique abilities as a central component of their defense. Elena spent these days training alongside Kale, who insisted on preparing her physically for whatever confrontation awaited at the border, even knowing her true strength lay in abilities no amount of physical training could enhance. "You may need to defend yourself directly if you're separated from our main forces," he explained during one such session in the palace training yard. "Your power is formidable, but it's not infinite, and you should never rely on it as your only means of protection." Elena absorbed his lessons with determined focus, grateful for his patient instruction despite her limited natural aptitude for combat. Their sessions also provided welcome distraction from the mounting anxiety she felt about the approaching conflict, though nothing could fully calm the nervous energy building within her as the day of departure for the northern border drew closer. Her evenings with Draven grew increasingly precious during this period, both of them aware that the coming confrontation carried genuine risk to both their lives and the fragile happiness they had found together over the preceding weeks. On the night before their departure, Draven came to her quarters, his expression carrying a seriousness that made Elena's heart ache with worry. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, taking her hands in his, "I need you to know that these past months have given me something I never expected to find as king of this kingdom. A genuine connection, built on honesty rather than fear or obligation. We'll face tomorrow together," Elena said firmly, though her own fear remained evident beneath her attempt at confidence, "and we'll face whatever comes after that together as well." Draven pulled her close, and they remained in comfortable silence for a long while. drawing strength from each other's presence, before the challenges of the coming day arrived, to test everything they had built between them. The journey to the northern border took 3 days, the combined forces of the Crimson Moon Kingdom, marching with grim determination through increasingly rugged terrain as they approached the territory where Roland's Shadowfang forces had massed. Elena rode alongside Draven and Kale, her nervousness growing with each passing mile, though she drew strength from the steady presence of the king beside her. They arrived at the border to find Roland's forces already arrayed across a wide valley, their numbers indeed substantial, though not quite as overwhelming as the earlier reports had suggested. Draven's own forces, bolstered by allied troops from neighboring territories who had agreed to support the Crimson Moon Kingdom against Roland's aggressive expansion, formed a formidable line facing their enemy across the valley floor. Roland himself rode forward from his own lines, flanked by several of his most trusted commanders, his expression carrying the confident arrogance of a leader who had rarely faced significant opposition to his ambitions. Draven rode forward to meet him, Elena and Kale accompanying him, despite the obvious danger of approaching the enemy leader so directly. "Draven," Roland called out, his voice carrying easily across the space between their forces. "I've come for what belongs to me. Hand over the voice, and I'll consider sparing your kingdom the destruction my forces are prepared to deliver." "She belongs to no one," Draven replied, his voice carrying the authority of a king, unwilling to be intimidated despite the significant forces arrayed against him. "And this kingdom will not surrender to threats from an alpha, whose ambitions have long exceeded his rightful boundaries." Roland's expression darkened with fury at the direct challenge, and Elena felt the tension in the air grow palpable, as both sides prepared for what seemed an inevitable clash. But before Roland could signal his forces to attack, Elena made a decision that surprised even herself, urging her horse forward until she stood directly between the two opposing leaders. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the valley despite the fear churning within her. "This conflict need not cost a single life today." Roland's eyes narrowed as he studied her, clearly recognizing exactly what she represented. "The voice speaks for herself now. How convenient. Perhaps you'll simply walk into my camp willingly, then, and spare everyone the trouble of battle." "I have no intention of joining you," Elena replied, steel entering her voice, despite the fear she felt facing an alpha of Roland's reputation directly. "But I do intend to end this conflict before it costs the lives of soldiers on both sides, who have no true stake in your personal ambitions." Roland laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed across the valley. "You think your little tricks frighten me? I've heard the stories of what your bloodline can supposedly do, but I don't believe a single command from you carries enough weight to stop my entire army." "Then perhaps you should reconsider that belief," Elena said, and gathering every ounce of conviction and power within her, she raised her voice to address not just Roland, but the entire assembled force of Shadowfang soldiers arrayed behind him. "Kneel," she commanded, pouring everything she had into the single word, every year of suppressed power finally released in this decisive moment. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Across the entire valley, Shadowfang soldiers began dropping to their knees, their wolves responding to a command their conscious minds could not resist, regardless of their loyalty to Roland or their willingness to fight. Even Roland's own trusted commanders, flanking him just moments before, found themselves sinking involuntarily to the ground, their expressions carrying stunned disbelief at the totality of Elena's power. Only Roland himself remained standing, his own considerable strength as an alpha allowing him to resist the full force of her command, though Elena could see the visible strain on his features as he fought against the pull of her power. "Impossible!" he gasped, his voice strained with the effort of remaining upright. "Kneel," Elena repeated, channeling every remaining bit of strength she possessed into the command. And finally, with obvious reluctance and fury, Roland's knees buckled beneath him, forcing him down alongside his entire assembled army. Silence fell across the valley, as both armies witnessed the extraordinary display of power, Crimson Moon soldiers staring in awe at the woman who had single-handedly neutralized their enemy's entire force, without a single blow being struck. Elena felt exhaustion crash over her immediately following the effort, her body trembling with the strain of commanding such an overwhelming number of shifters simultaneously, but she forced herself to remain upright, aware that the moment demanded her continued strength. Your ambitions end here, Roland, Draven said, riding forward to stand beside Elena, his expression carrying both pride and fierce protectiveness. You will withdraw your forces from this border and abandon any further aggression against my kingdom, or Elena will ensure your own army turns against you permanently. Roland, still kneeling despite his obvious fury, had little choice but to accept the terms forced upon him by circumstances entirely beyond his control. You'll pay for this humiliation, he snarled, though the threat carried little weight given his current position. Perhaps, Draven replied evenly. But not today, and not through the conquest you had planned. Elena finally released her hold on the command, watching as the Shadowfang soldiers slowly rose from their knees, confusion and residual fear evident on their faces as they processed what had just occurred. Roland rose as well, his expression carrying barely contained rage, but he made no further move toward aggression, understanding clearly that any renewed hostility would only invite the same devastating response. The Shadowfang forces withdrew from the border within the hour, their retreat marking a decisive end to the conflict that had threatened to engulf both kingdoms in devastating warfare. As their enemies' forces disappeared over the distant ridgeline, Draven's own soldiers erupted into celebration, their relief and gratitude evident in the cheers that echoed across the valley. Elena, exhausted but triumphant, found herself surrounded by soldiers offering their genuine thanks and admiration, a stark contrast to the fear and suspicion that had characterized her earlier weeks within the Crimson Moon Kingdom. Draven dismounted and helped her down from her own horse, his expression carrying deep pride and relief as he pulled her into a tight embrace. You saved this kingdom today, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Countless lives, spared because of your courage and your willingness to embrace what you truly are, rather than continuing to hide from it. We saved it together, Elena replied, resting her head against his shoulder, allowing herself finally to relax after the overwhelming tension of the confrontation. The journey back to the palace felt markedly different from their earlier march toward the border, the soldiers around them now regarding Elena with open admiration and gratitude rather than the wary suspicion that had followed her for so many weeks. Word of her decisive action spread quickly throughout the kingdom, transforming public perception of the Voice bloodline from ancient fear into something approaching genuine reverence. Upon their return to the palace, Draven called together his full council once more, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the earlier tension and hostility that had characterized previous discussions about Elena's presence within the kingdom. Even Lady Cassia, watching from among the assembled nobles, could not deny the undeniable proof of Elena's loyalty and value that the border confrontation had provided. Elena has proven beyond any doubt that her presence within this kingdom represents not a danger to be feared, but an extraordinary asset worthy of our deepest gratitude and respect, Draven announced to his assembled court, his voice carrying clear conviction. The ancient laws that once demanded her execution belong to a different era, born from fear rather than wisdom. I intend to formally set aside those laws as they pertain to her, and I ask this council to recognize her rightful place within this kingdom, not merely as a guest under my protection, but as someone essential to our continued safety and prosperity. The council members exchanged glances, and though a few still carried lingering reservations, the overwhelming sentiment following the day's dramatic events left little room for continued objection. One by one, the assembled nobles offered their formal acknowledgement of Elena's contribution, until even Lady Cassia, though clearly reluctant, added her own measured approval to the growing consensus. That evening, as celebrations continued throughout the palace in honor of the averted conflict, Draven led Elena to a quiet balcony, overlooking the kingdom she had helped save, the moon casting soft silver light across the peaceful courtyards below. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his with an expression of profound tenderness. Elena, he said, his voice carrying a weight of significance that made her breath catch, I have ruled this kingdom for years, surrounded by wolves who kneel before me out of fear, rather than genuine respect. But today, I witnessed something I never expected to find within these walls. A partner whose strength matches my own, whose courage inspires, rather than intimidates, and whose heart I have come to treasure beyond anything else in my life. He knelt before her then, a gesture that sent a ripple of stunned murmurs through the small gathering of guards and attendants who had followed them onto the balcony, witnessing an Alpha King, kneeling not out of compulsion or fear, but out of genuine reverence and love. I ask you to remain by my side, not as a prisoner, not merely as a protector of this kingdom, but as my equal and my queen, Draven said, his voice steady, despite the profound vulnerability of the moment. Will you accept that place beside me? Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked down at the man who had once dismissed her as an unworthy prisoner, now kneeling before her with nothing but genuine love and respect in his expression. Yes, she whispered, pulling him back to his feet and into her arms. I will. Word of their union spread quickly throughout the kingdom in the days that followed, and the wedding that eventually took place within the palace grounds drew celebration from every corner of the Crimson Moon territory. The woman once dismissed as a wolfless prisoner, unworthy of even a moment's consideration from the Alpha King, now stood beside him as queen, her command capable of bringing every royal wolf in the kingdom to their knees, yet chosen freely and completely as an equal partner rather than a feared ruler. The ancient fear that had once driven kingdoms to hunt down every member of the Voice bloodline gradually gave way, within the Crimson Moon Kingdom at least, to a new understanding that true strength lay not in the power to command through fear, but in the courage to protect through love, and that even a king who had never once knelt before another living soul could find, in the right person, someone truly worthy of that ultimate gesture of respect and devotion.